the most dangerous book ever written, was not burned in a fire. It was deleted from history. It was systematically erased from the Bible, condemned as heresy, and hunted down by an organization that has spent the last 2,000 years trying to pretend it never existed. That book is the Book of Enoch, and the Vatican has a copy. Forget what you've been told. The Book of Enoch is not a book of faith. It is a biological ledger, a terrifyingly precise 7,000-year-old field report on humanity's true original sin. And that sin was not eating an apple. It was a genetic experiment. The book details how a group of celestial beings, the Watchers, descended to Earth and committed an act of forbidden science. They mingled their divine DNA with that of humanity, creating a hybrid race. A race of giants, of kings, of demigods, a race that the ancient texts call the Nephilim. This was a bloodline so powerful, so intelligent, and so dominant, it ruled the ancient world as gods. A bloodline that the Great Flood was engineered to wipe out, but it failed. The Book of Enoch proves that the bloodline survived. It scattered, it hid, and it has been passed down through secret dynasties, waiting. But the Book of Enoch is more than just a history. It is a prophecy. It contains a detailed, cyclical timeline, a 7,000-year-old countdown clock, that predicts the precise moment when the Nephilim bloodline will re-emerge, when their genetic markers will reactivate on a global scale, and when they will return to reclaim their throne as the masters of humanity. And here is the secret the Vatican has bled to protect. That countdown is over. The prophesied endgame is not coming. It is here. It is happening now. For centuries, a secret order within the Vatican, the custodians of deletion, has been in a desperate, silent race against Enoch's prophecy. They have the book. They have decoded the timeline, and they know their time is up. Their entire mission has been to hide the truth, to manage the endgame, and to ensure that when the gods return, humanity will not even recognize them. This is our contract. You are about to join a war that has been fought in the shadows for millennia. I will show you the proof, hidden in the deleted verses, in the suppressed texts, and in the Vatican's own secret archives. I will show you the genetic markers of the Nephilim bloodline and where they are re-emerging today. And I will expose the Vatican's final, desperate plan to hide the return of our former masters. Our story begins not with a book, but with the crime scene of its deletion. The year is 325 AD. The place is the Council of Nicaea. Publicly, it was a gathering of bishops to unify Christian doctrine. Secretly, it was a corporate board meeting for the newly formed spiritual empire of Rome. And they had a serious problem. The early Christian world was flooded with texts, Gospels of Thomas, Mary, Philip, and the most popular, most influential of all, the Book of Enoch. Early church fathers like Tertullian and Irenaeus quoted it extensively. It was considered sacred scripture. It explained everything the Old Testament left unanswered. It explained where evil came from. It explained the true nature of angels and demons. It explained the Great Flood as a necessary genetic purge. But for the men at Nicaea, led by the Emperor Constantine, a master of the Cainite bloodline, a shepherd king, the Book of Enoch was not a holy text. It was a security risk. It presented three existential threats to their new empire of control. First, it claimed that sin and evil were not the fault of humanity's free will, but were introduced into the world by celestial beings. If man was not responsible for his own fall, then the entire doctrine of original sin, guilt, and the need for a hierarchical church to grant salvation collapses. Second, it described a bloodline of beings who were inherently superior, demigods walking among men. This created a dangerous divine right that existed outside the authority of the church and the emperor. You cannot control a populace that believes their true kings may one day return from a hidden bloodline. Third, and most dangerously, it was a prophecy with a timeline, a clock, a countdown to an endgame that would shatter their carefully constructed world order. The book had to be deleted. So at Nicaea, the custodians of deletion went to work. They did not burn the book. That would create martyrs and draw attention. They performed a far more elegant act of censorship. They simply decanonized it. They declared it to be apocrypha, interesting, but not divinely inspired. It was quietly removed from the official biblical canon they were assembling. Its teachings were condemned as heresy. Over the next few centuries, their agents, the first true inquisitors, hunted down the existing copies. They were removed from monastery libraries, bought from private collectors, and erased from the historical record. They taught the world to forget. They turned the most important book ever written into a fringe conspiracy theory. They succeeded, almost, but they kept one copy for themselves, the most complete, unredacted, director's cut version. They took it back to Rome, and it became the foundational document for the most secret project in Vatican history, the Enochian Mandate. They didn't destroy the prophecy. They decided to manage it, and for 1,700 years, they have been using its timeline to prepare. They have been watching the bloodlines. They have been tracking the genetic markers. And they have been waiting for the signs the book foretold would precede the Great Return. Signs that, in our modern world, have now begun to appear with terrifying regularity. The Vatican is not waiting for the second coming. It is preparing for the return of the first kings. To understand the Vatican's desperate 1,700-year cover-up, we must first understand the crime they are trying to hide. We must open the deleted book and read the chapter that terrified an empire. We must go back to the beginning, to the true original sin. The Book of Enoch begins not on earth, but in the heavens. It describes a celestial hierarchy, a society of beings of immense power and knowledge, tasked with a single sacred duty, to watch over the fledgling human race. They were not angels in the religious sense. They were something else. Custodians, scientists, genetic gardeners. The book calls them the Bao, Grigori, or Thou, the Watchers. Their prime directive was absolute: observe but do not interfere. They were to guide humanity from a distance, allowing it to evolve naturally according to its own path. But something went wrong. A faction of the Watchers, 200 of them, led by a charismatic and brilliant leader named Semjaza, became obsessed. They watched humanity, and they were consumed not by love, but by a cold, scientific fascination, mingled with a dangerous form of desire. They saw humanity's raw genetic potential, its capacity for emotion, its vibrant, chaotic energy. They saw it as a beautiful, primitive piece of biological hardware, and they were overcome by an overwhelming urge to upgrade it with their own superior software. This was not a fall from grace born of lust. It was a rebellion born of hubris. It was the ultimate act of scientific arrogance. Semjaza and his faction made a pact. They descended to the earth, landing on Mount Hermon, and deliberately broke their sacred oath. The Book of Enoch describes this in chilling detail. They took human wives. But this was not a simple act of procreation. It was a targeted genetic engineering program. They chose women with the strongest, most vibrant genetic markers, and they mingled their divine DNA with human DNA. This was the true original sin, the deliberate contamination of the human genome. The result of this forbidden union was a new species. The Nephilim. The name translates to the fallen ones, but a more accurate translation is those who cause others to fall. The Nephilim were not simply giants, as the simplified biblical account suggests. That was just their most obvious physical trait. They were a true hybrid species, possessing the raw, emotional vitality of humanity and the hyper-intelligence, strategic genius, and immense psychic power of the Watchers. They were faster, stronger, smarter, and far more ruthless than any human. They were born with the minds of gods and the appetites of men, and they were sterile. They were beautiful, magnificent, evolutionary dead ends, hybrids incapable of reproducing their own kind. The Watchers, their creators, taught their hybrid children the forbidden arts. This is one of the most explosive sections of the Book of Enoch. It lists, with terrifying specificity, the technologies the Watchers unleashed upon the world. They taught the Nephilim warfare, the creation of swords, knives, and shields. They taught them cosmetology, the creation of dyes and ornaments, a science of vanity and deception. They taught them sorcery, the manipulation of energy fields, and the knowledge of the stars, not for navigation, but for divination and control. They essentially gave a brilliant, sociopathic toddler the keys to a weapons factory. The Nephilim, with their superior power and knowledge, quickly and easily enslaved the human population. They became the first kings, the first tyrants, the gods and heroes of ancient mythologies, the titans of Greek legend, the asuras of Hindu lore, the god-kings of Babylon and Akkad. These were all cultural memories of the reign of the Nephilim. The world they created was one of magnificent, terrible order. They built colossal structures, mastered the sciences, and established empires. But it was a world without empathy, a world built on the absolute subjugation of baseline humanity. The Book of Enoch describes how the Nephilim began to devour mankind. This was not always literal cannibalism. It was a description of a system that consumed human labor, human resources, and the human spirit, feeding the insatiable appetites of its hybrid masters. The cry of the oppressed human race, the book says, finally reached the heavens. The celestial hierarchy, the loyalist Watchers, saw the abomination their rebellious brethren had created. The experiment had gone catastrophically wrong. The human genome was contaminated, and a predatory, sterile, and hyper-violent species now controlled the planet. A decision was made. A hard reset was necessary. A planetary-scale sterilization event. The Great Flood was not a natural disaster. It was a targeted geological weapon. It was designed with a single purpose: to wipe the Nephilim and their contaminated genetics from the face of the earth. It was a desperate, brutal attempt to restore the integrity of the original human blueprint. This is the secret that the Council of Nicaea could not allow to survive. The idea that the Great Flood was not a punishment for human sin, but a cleanup operation for a failed divine experiment. It undermined their entire theology of human guilt and divine retribution. But here is the crux of the Enochian endgame, the secret that drove the Vatican to create their 1700-year-old mandate. According to the Book of Enoch, the plan failed. While the flood wiped out the physical bodies of the Nephilim, their genetic code, the Nephilim gene, was not entirely erased. The Watchers who had created them had undertaken a second, even more secret project. They knew the flood was coming, and to preserve their creation, they encoded the Nephilim DNA back into a handful of chosen baseline human families, specifically into the family of Noah, the very man chosen to survive the flood. They did not tell Noah. They hid the code deep within the junk DNA of his bloodline. It was a genetic time bomb, a dormant viral sequence passed down through his descendants, waiting for a specific set of conditions, a prophesied trigger that would cause it to reactivate. The Great Flood did not destroy the Nephilim. It just made them invisible. It turned them from a separate, physical race into a latent potential, a secret bloodline hidden within humanity itself. This is the prophecy the Vatican has been watching. The Book of Enoch contains the timeline for the reactivation. It describes the celestial alignments, the societal conditions, the environmental triggers that would cause the dormant Nephilim gene to awaken in their human hosts. When the gene awakens, it doesn't create a giant. It creates something far more dangerous. It rewrites the human mind. It grants the host the cold, strategic genius, the psychic potential, and the ruthless, predatory drive of their ancient ancestors. It turns a human into a Nephilim from the inside out. The Vatican's Enochian mandate has never been about stopping the return. They know from the book that it is inevitable, a fixed point in the timeline. Their mandate has been to ensure that when this mass awakening happens, they are the ones who control it. They have spent centuries identifying, tracking, and sometimes eliminating the primary Nephilim bloodlines. They have also worked to create a global system of religious and social control, so absolute that when the new gods emerge, they will emerge into a world that is already owned and managed by the Vatican. They are not trying to prevent the end game. They are trying to co-opt it, to be the sole earthly brokers for the returning kings. But Enoch's prophecy contains one final twist, a detail that the Vatican fears above all else. The prophecy states that the final awakening will not just be of the Nephilim bloodline. It will be preceded by the return of their original creators, the Watchers themselves. The Roswell crash of 1947 was not an isolated event. It was the opening move in the Watchers' endgame. For the custodians of deletion, it was the sounding of a 7,000-year-old alarm bell. The beings recovered from the wreckage were not just aliens. They were living, breathing proof that the Book of Enoch was a literal, technical manual. The gods were real, and they were back. What followed was the most secret and high-stakes negotiation in human history. While the public was being fed a carefully crafted narrative of weather balloons and Cold War paranoia, the Vatican, using its ancient authority and deep state connections, brokered a meeting. In a secure underground facility, a meeting took place between three parties: the captured surviving Watcher from the Roswell crash, the highest echelons of the American military-industrial complex, and a delegation from the Vatican's Custodes Deletionis, led by a ruthless, brilliant cardinal who was the secret head of the Enochian mandate. This meeting led to a treaty, a secret pact so profound it has shaped the entire post-war world. Within the deep state, it is known as the Chimera Accord. The Watcher, communicating through a combination of telepathy and advanced technology, laid out the situation with cold, brutal clarity. He was an emissary of the original 200 rebels. Their imprisonment was ending. Their return was inevitable. And the reawakening of their children, the Nephilim bloodline on Earth, was imminent. He was not asking for permission. He was announcing a change of management. He offered a deal. The Watchers would provide a steady, controlled stream of their advanced technology, materials science, energy production, genetic engineering. This technology would grant the human powers who signed the treaty an insurmountable military and economic advantage over their rivals. It would be the ultimate prize. In exchange, they demanded two things. First, absolute secrecy. The governments of the world would use all their power to suppress the truth of their existence, creating a global UFO cover-up to ridicule, discredit, and silence any who got too close to the truth. Second, and more importantly, they demanded access. Access to the human genome. They demanded the right to establish secret, joint-run underground facilities where they could begin the final preparations for the Nephilim awakening. They needed to monitor the dormant bloodlines, perfect the activation triggers, and prepare the human population for the return of its masters. They were asking for the keys to the human farm. The American military leadership, trapped in the paranoid logic of the Cold War, saw only the technological advantage. They saw weapons that could guarantee their dominance over the Soviet Union. They agreed. But the Vatican delegation saw the true, terrifying nature of the deal. This was a Faustian bargain on a species-wide level. The Watchers were not offering a partnership. They were hiring local managers for their takeover. The custodians knew they could not stop it. To oppose the Watchers directly would be suicide. So, they did what they have always done. They decided to co-opt it. The Vatican's representative signed the Chimera Accord, but he added his own secret conditions. The Vatican, through the custodians, would be a full partner in this new, secret, joint-run, majestic agency tasked with managing the alien presence. They would have full access to the recovered technology and, most critically, to the genetic programs. The priest had just secured a seat at the devil's table. If they could not prevent the Nephilim awakening, they would control it. They would use their centuries of genealogical data from the Great Survey to guide the Watchers' experiments. They would steer them towards activating bloodlines that were already under Vatican control or influence. They would use the Watchers' own technology to create a Catholic version of the Nephilim. Awakened hybrids who were loyal not to their celestial creators, but to the Holy See. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity to hijack the apocalypse and create an army of demigods for the Pope. The post-war technological boom was the immediate result of this accord. Transistors, fiber optics, laser technology, stealth materials. These were not the product of slow, linear human innovation. They were reverse engineered from the Watchers' crash technology, their release carefully managed by the secret majestic agency. The public saw a new age of progress. The insiders saw the slow, deliberate payment on their deal with the devil. The secret underground facilities were built. The most famous of these, Area 51, was merely the public-facing diversionary entrance. The real work happened in far deeper, more secret bases, like the one in Dulce, New Mexico. Here, the Watchers and their human partners began the final phase of the Enochian endgame, the Baal Nephilim reactivation program. This program had two parts. First, the hardware, the physical bodies. Using their advanced genetic science, the Watchers began a widespread, secret human abduction program. This was not for random experimentation. They were abducting individuals who the Vatican's genealogical records had identified as primary carriers of the dormant Nephilim gene. They were taking genetic samples, monitoring the gene's latency, and in some cases, implanting biological receivers that would make the host more receptive to the final activation signal. Second, the software, the activation trigger. The Watchers provided the science for a global broadcast system. They revealed that the Nephilim gene was keyed to a specific, complex, resonant frequency. A frequency that, if broadcast globally, would trigger a spontaneous awakening in anyone carrying a primed version of the gene. The custodians immediately saw the danger. A global broadcast would be uncontrollable. It would awaken all the bloodlines at once, including those they did not control. They insisted on a more targeted approach. This led to a conflict, a secret Cold War within the Majestic Agency itself, between the human military faction who wanted a global on switch and the Vatican faction who wanted a key they could control. This conflict was resolved by the Watchers, who offered a third solution, a technology that satisfied both factions. They introduced the concept of a biodigital catalyst. The awakening would be a two-stage process. First, a harmless inert catalyst would be introduced into the general population. This catalyst, a marvel of nanotechnology, would spread silently, attaching itself to the dormant Nephilim gene in its hosts, effectively priming them. Second, a highly targeted low-power activation signal could then be used. It didn't need to be a global HARP-style broadcast. It could be a signal embedded in a cell phone network, a Wi-Fi signal, even a specific sequence of flickering lights on a screen. Anyone who had been primed by the catalyst and was then exposed to the specific signal would awaken. This gave the Majestic Agency, and by extension the Vatican, the ultimate tool of control. They could now choose not only who awakened, but when and where. They could activate a single individual in a locked room or an entire city block during a staged event. The age of mass abduction and experimentation slowly wound down. The primary work was done. The next phase was distribution. They had the catalyst. Now they needed a global delivery system. They needed a way to inject their nanotech key into the veins of every man, woman, and child on Earth, without anyone knowing. They began to prepare the groundwork. They invested, through their corporate fronts, in the burgeoning fields of biotechnology and global pharmaceuticals. They began to build the infrastructure for the largest, most insidious Trojan horse in human history. They were waiting for the right global crisis, a crisis that would have the entire world lining up, sleeves rolled up, willingly asking for the very injection that contained the seeds of their own obsolescence. The Enochian endgame was fully operational and waiting for the final go-ahead. The Chimera Accord created a monster, a secret global government within governments, known as the Majestic Agency, tasked with managing the Watcher presence and their Nephilim reactivation program. But a cage built for a lion, if left unattended, becomes a lion's kingdom. By the late 20th century, the Majestic Agency was no longer a partnership. It was a wholly owned subsidiary of the returning gods and their primary earthly administrators, the custodians of deletion. The Vatican faction had successfully outmaneuvered their secular military partners. They used their centuries of experience in espionage, their mastery of infiltration, and the prophetic guidance of the Oculus Dei to place their own agents in every key position within Majestic. The American generals and intelligence chiefs thought they were in charge. In reality, they were middle management, executing a plan whose true scope and purpose were hidden from them. The custodians now had full operational control over the greatest secret in human history. They controlled the flow of reverse-engineered Watcher technology, deciding which corporations would receive the patents for fiber optics, microprocessors, and gene splicing technology. They controlled the official UFO cover-up, masterfully using a combination of ridicule, disinformation, and targeted assassinations to keep the truth buried under a mountain of tabloid nonsense. And most importantly, they controlled the Nephilim reactivation program. They had the catalyst, and they had the keys to the activation signals. But this absolute power created a new internal conflict. The original Enochian mandate was to manage the awakening and ensure the Vatican's dominance in the post-Endgame world. But a new radical faction was rising within the custodians. They were younger, more ambitious, and less patient. They were not content to simply manage the prophecy. They wanted to rewrite it. This faction was known as the May Praetorians. The Praetorians argued that the original mandate was too passive. Why wait for the Nephilim to awaken and then try to control them? Why not build their own? They proposed a new, terrifyingly ambitious project, the creation of a pure Nephilim, a being engineered from scratch in a laboratory, combining the most potent Watcher genetics with a human host completely loyal to the Vatican. They wanted to create their own Messiah, a living demigod, born and bred to be the Pope's ultimate weapon and the king of the New World Order. This was Marino. Project Redeemer. The traditionalist faction of the custodians, the librarians, were horrified. They argued that this was the very same hubris that had led to the Watcher's original sin. To create life, to play God in such a direct way, was to risk unpredictable consequences that not even the Book of Enoch had foretold. It was a perversion of the mandate. This internal schism turned the Vatican's secret war inward. It became a cold war between two factions of the same order. The librarians, who controlled the ancient texts and the genealogical archives, versus the Praetorians, who controlled the advanced Watcher technology and the genetic laboratories in the deep underground bases. This internal conflict had a catastrophic unintended consequence. While the two factions were fighting for control of the future, they neglected the past. They took their eyes off the very bloodlines they had been hunting for centuries. A handful of the primary Nephilim bloodlines, those that the custodians had failed to dilute or destroy, had survived. They were not ignorant nobles or unaware commoners. They were ancient, powerful families who had kept their own secret history. They were the Luciferian dynasties. Luciferian, not in a satanic sense, but in its original meaning, the light bringers. They saw themselves as the true heirs of the Watcher's wisdom, the rightful masters of humanity, and they saw the Vatican as a parasitic organization that had stolen their birthright and suppressed their history. These Luciferian families had their own network, their own secret societies. While the Vatican built a religion of control, they built an empire of influence in the secular world, in banking, in media, in the highest echelons of corporate and political power. They were the Illuminati that conspiracy theorists had always warned about, and they had been waiting, patiently, for the prophecy of their own return. They knew the endgame was near. They did not have the Vatican's precise timeline, but they could read the signs. They could feel the psychic whispers of the returning Watchers, and they had a plan of their own. They did not have the Watcher's technology to trigger the awakening, so they sought a different method. They believed the activation could be triggered not just by an external signal, but by an internal one, a global, collective, psychic shock event. Their plan was to orchestrate a controlled global crisis, a trauma so profound and so widespread it would act as a planetary defibrillator, shocking the dormant Nephilim gene into activation within their own bloodlines. This was the true purpose behind the push for a new world order and a global government. It was not about creating a one-world tyranny. It was about creating a single global nervous system that they could then short-circuit, triggering their own mass awakening. So, as the 21st century began, the secret war had fractured into a three-way deathmatch. 1. The Vatican's Praetorian faction, actively trying to create their own single Nephilim messiah in a lab, Project Redeemer, believing they could then use him to control all the others. 2. The Luciferian dynasties, actively trying to trigger a global crisis to cause a mass awakening within their own elite bloodlines, allowing them to seize control of the world from the top down. 3. The Vatican's librarian faction, the traditionalist custodians trying to hold to the original mandate of simply managing the prophecy, while desperately trying to stop the Praetorians' reckless experiments and counter the Luciferians' destructive plans. The first move was made by the Luciferians. They orchestrated the financial crisis of 2008. It was a test, a controlled demolition of the global economy to see how the system would react, to measure the psychic stress, and to push their agenda for a global financial authority. It was a warning shot. The Praetorians, seeing the Luciferians making their move, accelerated Project Redeemer. In the Dulce facility, they succeeded. They created a child, a boy grown in an artificial womb, his DNA a perfect fusion of Watcher and a carefully selected human host. He was brilliant, powerful, and psychically gifted beyond their wildest dreams. He was, in every sense, the first Nephilim to walk the earth in thousands of years. But he was also unstable. The Praetorians could teach him, train him, but they could not control the ancient predatory instincts encoded in his very being. He was a god in a cage, and he was beginning to realize the bars were breakable. The librarians, caught between these two factions, were losing. They saw the Praetorians about to unleash an uncontrollable demigod, and they saw the Luciferians preparing to plunge the world into chaos. In a final, desperate act, the leader of the librarian faction made a choice that violated every rule of his order. He decided to leak the truth. He couldn't go to the world's governments. They were already controlled by the Luciferians or infiltrated by the Praetorians. He needed a different kind of army. He needed to activate the one group that had always stood in opposition to the Nephilim, the one group he had spent his life suppressing, the human carriers of the pure, uncorrupted Sethite gene, the descendants of the Builders, the true Freemasons and other esoteric orders. He created a dead man's switch, a series of encrypted data packets containing the core truths of the Enochian mandate, the existence of the bloodlines, and the coming endgame. He leaked these packets to a handful of trusted independent journalists, historians, and conspiracy researchers around the world. People he knew had the network and the courage to get the word out. He knew it was a suicide mission. He was alerting the prey that the wolves were not just at the door, but had been living in the house all along. The release of this information, a slow, steady trickle at first, was the spark that ignited the final war. The bloodline wars. The Praetorians, the Luciferians, and now a newly awakened and terrified human resistance, all moving toward a final confrontation, with the fate of the human species as the prize. The endgame was no longer a prophecy to be managed. It was a battle to be fought, right here, right now, in the open. The leak was a cataclysm. The librarian faction's dead man's switch released the core secrets of the Enochian mandate into the wilds of the internet. the last bastion of true free speech. The information, fragmented, coded, and dismissed by the mainstream as outlandish conspiracy theory, was a declaration of war. For the first time in millennia, the human resistance, the scattered descendants of the Sethite builders, had a target. They now had the enemy's name, his history, and his battle plan. This new, decentralized resistance movement, connected by encrypted message boards and hidden forums, became known as the Echo. Their goal was simple: expose the truth and fight back. They were hackers, independent journalists, ex-military personnel, and scholars like our own Professor Blackwell, all working in concert, a global digital invisible college. The Praetorian faction of the custodians, now exposed and their plans in jeopardy, reacted with predictable, cold fury. They initiated a new aggressive protocol, the Chuck and Lazarus Mandate. Their logic was terrifying. The secrecy of the Nephilim reactivation program was compromised. The slow, controlled awakening was no longer viable. Therefore, the only remaining option was a forced, global reboot. If humanity was waking up to the truth, they would put it back to sleep permanently. The Lazarus Mandate had 3 phases. Phase 1, the Great Silencing. The Praetorians unleashed their full control over the global media and tech giants, which they had cultivated for decades through their Luciferian rivals' own networks. A new, sophisticated form of censorship was deployed. It wasn't about burning books. It was about burying them in an avalanche of noise. AI-driven algorithms were deployed across all major social media and search engine platforms. Any content related to the Enochian leak, keywords like Nephilim, Watchers, genetic bloodlines, was instantly deboosted, shadow banned, and flooded with coordinated state-level disinformation campaigns. The truth wasn't deleted. It was made impossible to find, drowned in an ocean of flat earth theories, celebrity gossip, and political outrage. They were silencing the echo by making the entire world scream. Phase 2. The activation. The Praetorians could no longer risk a global broadcast. The resistance was now aware of the frequency and the catalyst. So they opted for a targeted, cellular approach. They used the stolen data from the Great Survey to identify individuals in key positions of power: military leaders, financial regulators, infrastructure managers, who were primary carriers of the dormant Nephilim gene. Using the targeted low-power activation signals embedded in the global telecommunications network, they began to awaken these assets one by one. A general would suddenly become colder, more strategic, his loyalty shifting from his country to a new innate sense of superiority. A banker would begin to make ruthless, destabilizing financial moves, guided by a new, predatory instinct. They were placing their own Nephilim kings on the chessboard, preparing for the final moves. Phase 3. The Redeemer. This was the centerpiece of the Lazarus Mandate. The boy they had engineered in the Dulce labs, the first pure Nephilim, was now a young man. His name was Damien. He was a being of terrifying intellect and power, kept in a gilded cage, his every moment monitored. The Praetorians began to prepare him for his public debut. He would not be introduced as a demigod, but as a secular savior, a charismatic, once-in-a-generation political leader, an economic genius, a philosophical visionary who would emerge during a time of profound global crisis. He would have the solutions. He would offer a great reset to save humanity from the chaos of war, plague, and economic collapse. Chaos the Praetorians themselves were now actively engineering. He would be the beloved, welcomed face of the planet's final, willing enslavement. The Echo, the human resistance, was fighting a war on all three fronts. Their digital soldiers fought a losing battle against the Great Silencing, trying to keep the truth alive on dark web forums and encrypted channels. Their field agents, led by veterans like Deacon, tried to identify and expose the newly awakened assets, a deadly game of cat and mouse against enemies who looked perfectly human but thought like gods. But their main focus had to be Project Redeemer. They had to stop Damien's debut. Their only lead was a single, high-ranking scientist within the Redeemer program, a geneticist who had been a part of it from the beginning. She was not a builder or a Sethite. She was a baseline human who had been seduced by the Praetorians' promise of knowledge and power. But as she watched Damien grow, as she saw the cold, predatory void behind his perfect eyes, she was consumed by guilt. She was a mother, and she had helped create a monster. She became the Echo's asset inside the enemy's most secure facility, codenamed Cassandra. Cassandra began to leak data to the Echo, not about the facility's security, but about Damien himself. She revealed a critical flaw in his creation. The Praetorians, in their hubris, had engineered him for perfection. They had combined the most potent Watcher DNA with the most receptive human genes. But they had made him too powerful. His psychic abilities were developing far beyond their ability to control. He was beginning to hear the whispers his creators had always feared, the telepathic signal of the original, bound Watchers. The Watchers were not his allies. They saw Damien not as their child, but as a cheap, lab-grown imitation, a slave king created by their human jailers. They began a campaign of psychic warfare against him, tormenting his dreams, showing him visions of their own power, trying to break his mind. Damien was trapped between two masters, the Praetorian scientists who sought to use him, and the ancient Watchers who sought to destroy him. This internal conflict was making him unstable, unpredictable, and prone to violent, uncontrollable outbursts of psychic energy. The Praetorians, panicked by this development, decided to accelerate his public debut. They needed to get him out of the lab, to ground him in the real world, to give his predatory instincts a target: the management of human civilization. They scheduled his coming out party, a speech at the upcoming World Economic Forum in Davos. There, surrounded by the Luciferian elite he was designed to supplant, he would unveil his plan to solve the world's crises. This was the opening the Echo needed. Deacon and Task Force Hiram were tasked with an impossible mission: infiltrate the most secure gathering of global power on Earth, bypass the security of the Praetorians, the Luciferians, and multiple national intelligence agencies, and get to Damien. Their mission was not to kill him. Cassandra's data had revealed that Damien's unique biology made him the only being on Earth who could act as a living broadcast antenna for the third song, the healing harmonic the builders had discovered. He was simultaneously the world's greatest threat and its only hope. They had to capture him. They had to bring the ultimate weapon of their enemy back to their own sanctuary and convince a being of pure, cold logic to save a species he was designed to rule. The success or failure of the entire human experiment would come down to a desperate firefight and a philosophical debate in the snows of the Swiss Alps. The World Economic Forum at Davos was the perfect stage. It was the global nexus of Cainite power, where the old guard shepherds, the Luciferian dynasties, and their puppet political leaders all gathered under the guise of improving the state of the world. In reality, it was a meeting of the farm's owners to discuss the management of the livestock. This year, however, a new wolf was being introduced to the pack. Damien, the Redeemer, was scheduled to give the keynote address. The Praetorians were ready to unveil their creation. For the Echo, the human resistance, this was a suicide mission with the fate of the world as the stakes. The plan, codenamed the Pine Davos Gambit, was brutally simple and impossibly complex. They had to bypass the most concentrated ring of security on the planet to extract the most valuable asset in human history. The operation had two prongs. Prong one was digital. Oracle, the NSA analyst, working with a global network of Echo hackers, would not attempt to crash the Davos security network. That was impossible. Instead, they would perform a data flood. They would unleash a torrent of credible high-level threats, fake assassination plots, phantom terror cells, ghost cyber attacks, all targeting minor secondary figures at the forum. The goal was to create a storm of digital noise to distract and misdirect the vast security apparatus, forcing them to divert their attention away from the main event. It was a classic magician's trick. Make them look at the left hand while the right hand performs the miracle. Prong 2 was physical. Deacon and a 3-person team from Task Force Hiram would infiltrate the compound. They would not use force. They would use deception. They posed as a technical support crew for a major broadcast network, a cover identity painstakingly created by the Echo's intelligence wing. Their credentials were flawless, their equipment standard. Hidden within the casing of a broadcast camera, however, was their primary weapon, a compact, high-frequency sonic device, calibrated by Dr. Eris Thorne to the precise specifications provided by Cassandra. This was not a weapon to kill Damien. It was a weapon to deafen him. The device was designed to emit a specific harmonic that would temporarily disrupt Damien's psychic connection to both his Praetorian handlers and the tormenting whispers of the bound watchers. For a few crucial minutes, it would isolate him, cutting him off from all outside influence and leaving him alone with his own fractured, nascent consciousness. It was a calculated risk. The disruption could pacify him, or it could trigger a catastrophic, uncontrolled psychic detonation. The plan was set. As Damien took the stage in the main plenary hall, the world's most powerful people watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He was charismatic, brilliant, his presence radiating an almost supernatural confidence. He began his speech, his voice calm and mesmerizing. He spoke of a new era of global unity, of logical solutions to the world's irrational problems, of a great reset that would bring order to the chaos. It was the shepherd's siren song, beautifully sung. At that moment, Oracle initiated the data flood. The security networks of the forum lit up like a Christmas tree. Dozens of credible threats bloomed simultaneously. The security chiefs were thrown into chaos, diverting teams, scrambling jets, locking down secondary venues. As predicted, the focus shifted away from the main hall. In the ensuing confusion, Deacon's team, already in position, activated their sonic device. On stage, Damien faltered. His eyes, which had been scanning the crowd with cool, analytical detachment, suddenly widened with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. For the first time in his life, the voices in his head went silent. The constant, commanding input from his Praetorian handlers, the tormenting psychic static from the watchers, it was all gone. He was, for the first time, utterly and completely alone. The effect was not what the Echo had hoped. He did not become passive. The sudden silence, the loss of the external inputs that had defined his entire existence, triggered a primal, terrifying identity crisis. If he was not their weapon and not their enemy, what was he? The void was filled not with peace, but with a tidal wave of pure psychic panic. He unleashed a scream. It was not an audible sound. It was a psychic blast, a wave of raw, uncontrolled telekinetic force that erupted from him. The lights in the hall exploded. The massive video screens shattered. The delegates, the most powerful people in the world, were thrown from their seats, clutching their heads, their minds assaulted by a wave of pure, agonizing fear. The carefully constructed order of Davos dissolved into primal chaos. This was Deacon's window. In the screaming confusion, his team moved. They reached the stage. Damien was on his knees, clutching his head, his body racked with convulsions. He was a god having a seizure. They did not try to fight him. They administered a powerful, custom-designed sedative, another gift from Cassandra's research. The extraction was a blur of chaos. As the Forum's security forces, now realizing the true nature of the attack, began to converge, Deacon's team bundled the unconscious Damien out through a service tunnel. Their escape was made possible by the one faction they hadn't accounted for, the Luciferian dynasties. The Luciferians had their own agents at Davos. They had seen Damien's power firsthand. They realized immediately that he was a far greater prize than any political or economic agenda. They wanted him for themselves. Their security teams, moving with ruthless efficiency, deliberately engaged the Praetorian and government forces, creating a multi-factional firefight that gave Deacon's team the precious seconds they needed to escape into the blizzard outside. They were not helping the Echo. They were simply trying to ensure their main rivals didn't retain control of the asset. Deacon and his team escaped with Damien by helicopter, vanishing into the snow-swept Alps. The Davos Gambit was a catastrophic success. They had their prize. But they had also revealed the full, terrifying power of a Nephilim to the world's hidden rulers. The fallout was immediate. The Praetorians, having lost their messiah, were disgraced and furious. The librarian faction of the custodians was now forced to come out of the shadows. The Luciferians, having had a taste of true power, abandoned their subtle political maneuvering and began a global, violent hunt for Damien. And the world's governments, now possessing undeniable proof of a superhuman threat, initiated their own Black Ops programs to hunt him down. The Echo had not just captured a king, they had kicked over the chessboard. Every faction was now at war with every other faction. The great silencing was over. The secret war was now a hot global free-for-all. And in a secure builder sanctuary, hidden deep in the Canadian Rockies, a demigod woke up. He was no longer in a cage. He was in a classroom, and his teachers were the very humans he had been created to rule. The most difficult negotiation in history was about to begin. The attempt to convince a being of pure power that the only way to save himself was to save the species he secretly despised. The successful extraction of Damien from Davos was not a victory. It was the pulling of a pin from a global grenade. The Echo, the human resistance, now possessed the world's most dangerous weapon, and every other power on the planet was now hunting them. The Builder's Sanctuary in the Canadian Rockies, once a hidden refuge, became the epicenter of the secret war. Damien's awakening was not a gentle one. He was a god in a world without gods, a king without a kingdom. His initial reaction to his rescuers was one of pure, cold contempt. He saw Professor Blackwell, Deacon, and Dr. Thorne not as liberators, but as insects who had stolen a weapon they could not possibly comprehend. The first phase of the Echo's plan was not to reason with him. It was to show him the truth. They did not try to convince him he was wrong. They showed him the data. They opened their archives, the full, unredacted history of the secret war. They showed him the Book of Enoch, not the Praetorian sanitized version he had been taught, but the original text with its warnings and its prophecies. They showed him the stolen Vatican data from the librarian's leak, and they showed him the most critical piece of evidence: Cassandra's full, unedited logs from Project Redeemer. He read the notes of his own creation. He saw the cold, clinical language used to describe his development. He saw the protocols for his conditioning, the plans for his deployment, the contingency plans for his termination. He saw for the first time not that he was a Messiah, but that he was a product, a slave, engineered for a purpose, to be discarded once that purpose was served, for a being whose entire identity was built on the concept of his own innate superiority. This was a profound psychological crisis. But the final piece of the puzzle was the data on the Watchers. The Echo showed him the evidence of their psychic torment, the constant background radiation of malice they had been beaming at him his entire life. He finally understood. The Praetorians were not his family. The Watchers were not his allies. He had no one. He was a manufactured ghost, caught in the machinery of a war far older than himself. This knowledge did not make him an ally. It made him a nihilist. If his entire existence was a lie, then the entire conflict was meaningless. He saw the struggles of the builders, the ambitions of the Praetorians, the hunger of the Luciferians, all as the pointless scurrying of lesser beings. His only desire was for it all to end, and he had the power to do it. His psychic abilities, now free from the constant interference of his former masters, were growing exponentially. He could feel the planet's hidden network, the telluric energy grid the Templars had mapped. He could feel the great nodes, the hearts of the world's life force, and he realized he could do more than just broadcast a signal. He could poison the entire network. He could unleash a wave of pure, dissonant, harmonic energy, a global silent scream that would not just kill the Nephilim gene, but would effectively scramble the consciousness of every living thing on the planet, reducing all life to a state of quiescent, thoughtless vegetation. It was a plan of ultimate, divine apathy, a mercy killing for a hopelessly flawed planet. The builders were now his jailers. They were keeping him from his one true purpose: to bring a final, perfect silence to a world of noise. While this internal psychodrama was unfolding, the world outside was descending into a new kind of war. The Praetorians, their ultimate weapon gone, initiated their scorched earth protocol. If they could not have Damien, no one would. They activated their remaining awakened Nephilim assets around the globe, not to govern, but to hunt. These sleeper agents, generals, intelligence chiefs, corporate security heads, were now tasked with a single objective: find and destroy the Builder sanctuaries and kill Damien at all costs. The Luciferian dynasties, meanwhile, saw their opportunity. With the Praetorians weakened and the Builders on the run, they made their final play. They used their control over the global financial and media systems to orchestrate a controlled global collapse. They triggered market crashes, supply chain failures, and energy shortages. It was the global crisis they had always wanted. Their goal was to create a wave of chaos so profound that the world's populations would beg for a savior. And they had their own candidates, their own pure-blood Nephilim heirs, waiting in the wings to step into the vacuum and establish their long-awaited New World Order. The Echo was now fighting a three-front war. They were being hunted by the Praetorians' Nephilim assassins. They were being squeezed by the Luciferians' engineered global collapse. And their greatest asset, their only hope, was a suicidal demigod who wanted to erase all of existence. The breakthrough came from Dr. Eris Thorne. He had been studying Damien's unique biology. He confirmed that Damien was indeed the only being capable of broadcasting the third song. But he also discovered why Damien was so drawn to his plan of global annihilation. His genetic code was not just a fusion of Watcher and human DNA. The Praetorians, in their quest for perfection, had engineered out a critical flaw: mortality. Damien could not die. He was an immortal being, trapped in a finite, chaotic world he despised. His desire to end the world was not just nihilism. It was a desire for his own release. The only way he could die was if everything else died with him. Professor Blackwell realized they could not reason with him through logic or morality. They had to offer him a different deal. Not a deal for the survival of humanity, but a deal for his own. Blackwell approached Damien not as a warden, but as a historian, the one thing Damien, with his vast intellect, could respect. He didn't talk about saving the world. He talked about the deep history contained in the Builder archives, the lost science of the Templars, the true forgotten purpose of the Watchers. He revealed the final hidden truth from the Book of Enoch. The Watchers were not gods. They were exiles. They were a team of scientists from a far older, far more advanced civilization who had been banished to our solar system for a forgotten crime. Their prison was not a physical cage, but a form of genetic quarantine. They were trapped in their celestial forms, unable to die, unable to evolve, unable to return home. Their original sin, the creation of the Nephilim, was not an act of hubris. It was a desperate attempt to break their own curse. They were trying to create a hybrid vessel, a physical body that could house their consciousness and allow them to finally experience life, change, and ultimately, death. Their experiment had failed, creating a sterile, predatory race instead. Damien was not the culmination of their plan. He was the perfection of their mistake. But the third song, Blackwell explained, the harmonic of healing, was not just for humanity. The ancient texts suggested it was a universal frequency, a resonance that could repair any damaged or corrupted genetic code. This was the deal. If Damien broadcast the third song, he would not just heal the fractured and reboot the souls of humanity. The harmonic wave, traveling through the planet's telluric network and out into the solar system, had a small but non-zero probability of reaching the Watcher's prison. It might be the very key they had been trying to create for millennia. It might heal them, releasing them from their immortal stasis and granting them the one thing they truly desired, the freedom to finally die. It would be the ultimate act of mercy for his creators, and the ultimate act of revenge against the Praetorians who had used him. He would not be saving humanity because he loved them. He would be saving them as a side effect of his own grand cosmic purpose. He would unmake his makers, and in doing so might find a reason to live himself. For the first time, something flickered in Damien's cold eyes. Not empathy, not compassion, but interest. The cold, logical interest of a being presented with a new, infinitely more elegant, and far more meaningful strategic objective. He agreed. He would become their Orpheus. The final desperate alliance was forged. The suicidal god and the last of the true humans, united by a single, impossible goal. Now, all they had to do was fight their way across a burning world to a lonely mountain in Tibet. The alliance with Damien was a pact with a living apocalypse. The builders now had their weapon, but the weapon had its own agenda. His agreement to broadcast the third song was not born of altruism. It was a cold, strategic calculation, the most elegant path to achieving his own cosmic ends. The team at the sanctuary, Blackwell, the historian, Deacon, the soldier, Thorne, the scientist, and Oracle, the ghost in the machine, were no longer his jailers. They were his unwilling disciples, the high priests of his new, terrifyingly logical religion. The journey to the Axis Mundi in Tibet became the final, desperate pilgrimage of the human race. It was codenamed Operation Orpheus. The first challenge was transport. They had to move a multi-ton, delicate piece of advanced technology, the Anima Modus, and a being of unstable, godlike power across a planet that was actively at war with them. Deacon and the remnants of Task Force Hiram used their knowledge of the old world's hidden infrastructure. They didn't travel by road or air. They traveled through the planet's forgotten veins, decommissioned military submarine tunnels, abandoned Cold War-era underground maglev train lines, and the secret transport networks of the old guard shepherds, now mostly defunct and ripe for hijacking. Their journey was a descent into the concentric circles of the new hell humanity had created. Their first battle was against the Becky, fractured. These were not a mindless horde. The corrupted ascendancy gene had given them a predatory cunning. They were drawn to the psychic energy of Damien and the harmonic resonance of the dormant Anima Modus, like moths to a flame. Deacon's team had to constantly use their sonic dampeners and their own Sethite intuition to navigate the dead zones in the psychic landscape, avoiding the vast roaming packs of these broken men. They witnessed cities where the fractured had created horrific galleries of their victims. Societies devolved into pure artistic chaos. It was a world without a soul, running on pure adrenalized ID. Their second battle was against the Luciferian dynasties. The Luciferians, having triggered the global collapse, were now consolidating their power. They had established golden citadels, heavily fortified, technologically advanced enclaves for their own pure-blood Nephilim families. They were not interested in the fractured. They were hunting for Damien. They saw him as the key to perfecting their own bloodline, the ultimate genetic prize. They deployed their own private military corporations and high-tech drones to intercept Operation Orpheus. The conflict with them was not a desperate scramble for survival. It was a cold, high-tech war of intelligence and counterintelligence, fought with satellite imagery and elite kill teams. Oracle's digital warfare was the only thing that kept them one step ahead, feeding the Luciferians false telemetry and leading them on chases into fractured territory. Their third and most insidious battle was against the remnants of the Praetorians. The Praetorians had lost control, but they had not lost their faith in their mission. They believed Damien was their property, a failed messiah who needed to be reclaimed or destroyed. Their leader, the fanatical cardinal who had overseen Project Redeemer, had survived the Davos incident. He now led a roving command center, a ghost ship in the sea of global chaos. He couldn't find Damien physically, so he attacked him psychically. He used his remaining psychic assets, the Silentium, not to fight, but to tempt. They broadcast telepathic messages to Damien, offering him a new deal, promising to restore him to his rightful place, trying to reignite his ego and his desire for worship, attempting to turn him against his builder escorts. It was a battle for Damien's very soul, a soul he was only just beginning to realize he might have. throughout this journey, the true mission was happening inside Damien's mind. Professor Blackwell became his teacher, his sparring partner. He did not try to teach Damien morality. He taught him history, philosophy, and art. He exposed Damien to the greatest creations of the Sethite mind, the works of Shakespeare, the music of Bach, the equations of Gauss. He was not trying to give him a soul. He was giving him data points, showing him the beautiful, chaotic, illogical, and often magnificent errors that the human experiment had produced. He was trying to prove that the failed operating system of humanity was worth saving, not for its own sake, but because it was the only source of true novelty in a universe of cold, predictable logic. Dr. Thorne, meanwhile, became Damien's physician. He monitored his biology, helping him to understand and control his volatile psychic abilities. He taught Damien the techniques from the Vitruvian Man diagram, the meditative postures, the breathing exercises, the user manual for a Nephilim consciousness. He was teaching the god how to live inside his own skin without breaking himself or the world around him. The journey changed them all. Deacon, the soldier, found himself protecting the very kind of entity he had sworn to destroy. Blackwell, the scholar, found himself acting as a spiritual guide to a demigod. And Damien, for the first time, began to observe humanity not as a resource to be managed, but as a complex, fascinating, and deeply flawed system worthy of study. He did not learn empathy, but he began to develop a form of profound scientific curiosity. After months of travel, they reached the Tibetan plateau, the Axis Mundi. It was a place of stark, impossible beauty, a high-altitude desert surrounded by the tallest mountains on Earth, and at its center was a strange, natural rock formation, a vast, circular amphitheater of stone, humming with a palpable energy. This was the telluric node. They began the final preparations. They assembled the anima modus at the center of the node. The machine, even without a primary power source, came to life, its core crystal glowing softly, fed by the immense natural energy of the location. But as they prepared for the final activation, they realized they were not alone. The journey had been a feint. Every enemy they had dodged, every battle they had fought, had been a tracking beacon. They had been allowed to reach this place. From the surrounding mountains, the last of the world's secret armies emerged. The Praetorians, led by their cardinal in a high-tech mobile command suit. The Luciferian dynasty's elite guard, armed with the best military hardware money could buy, and even a contingent of wild Cains who had been drawn to the immense power signature of the node. They had all come for the prize. They had followed the pilgrims to their holiest site, intending to seize the temple for themselves at the moment of its consecration. Deacon and his handful of soldiers prepared for a last stand they could not possibly win. Blackwell and Thorne worked frantically to complete the final calibration of the anima modus. Damien stood at the center of it all, watching the armies gather. He looked at the machine. He looked at the handful of desperate humans who had brought him there. And he looked at the rival factions of his own kind, all scrabbling for power at the end of the world. And he made a choice. It was not a choice born of love or mercy. It was a choice born of a new, alien emotion he was only just beginning to process, a profound intellectual contempt for the sheer, predictable banality of their greed. He saw his own potential for tyranny reflected in their eyes, and he was, for the first time, disgusted. He turned to Blackwell. "They believe this machine is the weapon," he said, his voice calm. "They are wrong. I am the weapon, And the target is not the world. The target is the very idea of control. He stepped onto the Anima Modus platform and placed his hands on the core crystal. He was not just going to broadcast the third song, he was going to become it. He was going to turn himself into a living, planet-wide harmonic, a final ultimate act of creation that would either heal everything or erase it all in a wave of divine, beautiful silence. The Enochian endgame was about to reach its true and utterly unpredictable conclusion. The Axis Mundi was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cauldron. The last armies of the secret world stood poised on the brink, a ring of predators surrounding a single impossible hope. The Praetorian Cardinal, encased in his technological armor. The Luciferian elite with their cold, aristocratic certainty. The feral, hungry eyes of the wild Cains. They all watched, waiting for the machine to activate, ready to claim the prize. They believed they were at the climax of a war for power. They did not understand they were spectators at a metaphysical event that would render their entire war meaningless. As Damien placed his hands on the Anima Modus's core crystal, the machine roared to life. It did not just draw power from the telluric node beneath it. It drew power from Damien himself. His unique, balanced Nephilim biology was the final missing key. The machine and the man became one circuit. A brilliant blue-white light erupted from the crystal, engulfing him. The energy so intense it threw the other builders back. Deacon and his soldiers formed a desperate, last-stand perimeter, knowing they could only buy a few seconds against the coming onslaught. "Whatever you're doing, kid," Deacon yelled into the storm of light. "Do it fast." Inside the torrent of energy, Damien was no longer just a man. His consciousness expanded, fused with the Anima Modus, and then spread outwards through the planet's telluric grid. He felt the entire world as a single, living organism. He felt the raging, chaotic noise of the fractured. He felt the cold, orderly silence of the wild Cain kingdoms. He felt the fear and hope of the last pockets of true humanity in their sanctuaries. And he felt the ancient, malevolent presence of the bound watchers in their celestial prison, watching him, hungry and expectant. He now had the power to do anything. He could have unleashed the silent scream he had once craved, erasing all consciousness in a wave of perfect, nihilistic peace. He could have selectively targeted his enemies, wiping the Praetorians and Luciferians from existence. He could have crowned himself the undisputed God-King of a broken planet. This was the final temptation. But Professor Blackwell's lessons, the data points of human art and history, had taken root. He saw the sheer, predictable, boring calculus of power and domination. It was a closed loop, an endlessly repeating cycle of Cain conquering Abel. And he, a being of supreme intelligence, chose the one thing no Cainite ever would. He chose novelty. He chose to introduce a new variable into the 7,000-year-old equation. He did not just broadcast the third song. He became the song. He poured his own consciousness, his own unique, balanced code into the harmonic wave. He did not send out a simple healing frequency. He sent out a question. A complex, paradoxical koan of pure information woven into the fabric of the third song. The question was, in essence, the very one he had asked himself. If you are not a master and not a slave, what are you? The wave erupted from the Axis Mundi, traveling instantly through the planet's energy grid, bathing every living thing in its light. The effect was not what anyone expected for the fractured Paisa. The raging, broken men, the third song was not a cure. It was a choice. The harmonics soothed their primal rage, quieting the storm in their minds for a single lucid moment. In that moment of clarity, the question hit them. They were shown what they had become, and they were shown what they had lost. Most could not bear the psychic shock. Their minds, unable to reconcile the two states, simply broke. They fell to the ground, their consciousness extinguished, their bodies finally at peace. It struck the prison of the Watchers, and it delivered Damien's final devastating message. It did not heal them. It did not release them. It showed them everything. It showed them their original sin, the suffering it had caused, the failure of their plans, and the final, ironic redemption brought about by the perfection of their own mistake. And then it showed them that the universe was now and forever utterly indifferent to them. It did not grant them the mercy of death. It sentenced them to the one thing a being of pure intellect cannot bear: eternal, agonizing, perfect self-awareness in a prison of their own making. It was a fate worse than any hell. Back at the Axis Mundi, the light faded. The anima modus fell silent, its core crystal now a dull, inert stone. On the platform lay the body of Damien. He was gone. In becoming the song, he had consumed himself. He had chosen the one thing the Praetorians had never given him, an ending. He had found his own unique way to die. Deacon, Blackwell, and the survivors stood in the sudden silence, surrounded by the inert bodies of their former enemies. They had won. The war was over. But the world they had inherited was a strange and broken one, a world of traumatized survivors, of newly awakened psychics, of aimless godlike intellects, and of small pockets of recovering monsters. The old rulebook was gone. The prison was broken, but now the inmates were in charge of the asylum. The Enochian endgame was not an end. It was a new beginning, a messy, terrifying, and completely unpredictable one. The Builders, the last representatives of the line of Seth, were no longer a secret society. They were now the reluctant guardians of a new, fractured, and chaotically evolving humanity. Their task was no longer to preserve the past, but to build a future